Before I do that, I want to sort of understand who all of you are. How many of you are professors and students here at CSU? Okay, great. And how many of you are thinking about a career in the legal sector, maybe being an attorney? Great. Okay. How many of you are immigrants or have immigrant families? Okay, great. So this issue is extremely important here in the Central Valley. Like Jim said, my office is based in Oakland, but we have offices now in Modesto and in Stockton. And there is a keen lack of attorneys here doing deportation defense. For the people who are in this, it is extremely stressful work. It is very difficult to have the lives of people who come to the U.S. largely because they don't have an opportunity in their own country. But the stereotype about people who come here to the U.S. is that they're here to abuse a system or to abuse a process. But in reality, the experience that I have and the attorneys at SJC have are people who come to the U.S. are fleeing something, they're fleeing violence, and a lot of times if they are deported, they're going to be killed. So, you know, this issue is not only a social justice issue, but it's an issue about us as Americans. Are we going to be humane? Do we have a humane system? And unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that we don't. And the fact that, you know, you're here makes me happy to think that in the future some of you may be attorneys and may want to do this work. And I hope that you would want to stay here in the Central Valley where the need is increasing. So we just heard the presentation before us go through how deportations have increased exponentially over the past 2 decades. And a lot of that is because of the law that was passed under the Clinton administration in 1996. And unfortunately, the nonprofit sector, which largely helps low-income people, has not caught up with the need for deportation defense. When you think of immigrant-centered nonprofits in California, you think about organizations that say fill out paperwork and try to get visas. That's typically what goes on in the nonprofit sector. And so when my co-founder and I started SJC in 2012, our vision was to bring this very important issue into the nonprofit sphere in order to provide an avenue for people who are low income. And like I said, this work is very stressful, and so what ends up happening is private attorneys charge an arm and a leg, literally, for deportation defense. And people who come here very recently are put into the deportation process at the time they're apprehended. And most apprehensions are not what you think. They're not people jumping over fences. It is people standing in lines trying to get into the U.S., presenting their claim for what we call asylum to an immigration officer, and they have to wait. They're immediately tossed into a detention center where they have to wait upwards of 30 days to get a 15-minute interview with a bureaucrat who really doesn't care about their case. And if they are able to convince that bureaucrat after 15 minutes that they should have an opportunity to stand in front of a judge, you know, and hire an attorney to help them in their case, then they can actually present their asylum case. What happens is that these people have spent so much money en route to the U.S., it's impossible for them to afford legal defense. And so over 90% of non-citizens in removal proceedings don't have an attorney. Most of those individuals are, in fact, Hispanic, and English is not their first language. Sometimes we have clients whose Spanish is not their first language. They speak an indigenous dialect from either southern Mexico, Guatemala. And as a result of this, there are systemic pressures which actually prevent our clients, you know, these are future Americans, people who are the fabric of our community here in California, from being able to advance themselves. So I want to ask you all a question. Do you think, and I want participation here, do you guys think that when someone comes into the United States and they pass that interview that I talked about, that 15-minute interview, do you think they should have a right to leave a detention center, should they have a right to leave that detention center and actually start participating in our community? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So are the other answers yes? Okay. And what do you think if I told you that the government charges people a bond to leave this detention center? What do you think would be a fair amount? Let's just throw out a number. What do you think is a fair amount to charge people? And by the way, you know nothing about their financial status, because that's not part of the inquiry at all. Whether you make $100,000 US a year or 5,000 is not part of this inquiry. Yes?
Well, you could look the same way you do anyone in detention, but the risk of showing up for the hearing. And you could say in this case, though, it's not a crime for you to begin as well. It's always an alleged crime in any case. So I would say it depends on, risk of not showing up for the hearing.
Right. So let's put a monetary value on that, right? Because that's what bond's all about in our criminal system. So that's applied directly for our immigration detention system. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. Absolutely. So it is not uncommon for people who don't have more than, say 50 cents in their pocket to not get a bond at all because you have no right to a bond, right? So if you're an individual charged with a crime in the state of California, you actually have a right to a bond. You don't have one even if you've never committed a crime and you're just not a U.S. citizen. Second, if you get a bond, it is not uncommon for it to be $7,000, $8,000, $10,000. I see, $20,000 bonds. And what's even more shocking about the system is that there's no standard that judges have to use in setting these bonds. So you have judges in California who tend to be more progressive-minded people, and let's be honest about that, that is the case, setting lower bonds. And you have judges in border towns setting bonds extremely high. And what ends up happening is that the individuals who come here out of a genuine fear for their life end up having to get sent back because they can't afford a bond, they can't afford an attorney. The process for seeking asylum when you are detained is so much higher. It's so much more difficult because you as the individual have to present your case. And so it's your burden to show that you are someone who would be persecuted if you return back to the country of your origin. So going back to this concept of individuals coming to this country and seeking asylum, those are primarily the cases that we see at SJC. They are over 90% of the cases that we see. And a lot of the individuals who come here, if they are able, they're lucky to make it through the process, they pass the interview, they need to settle somewhere. Invariably, if there's some family member here in California, they come and settle close to those family members. And because of the history of our labor system in California, the Central Valley is a critical location for labor. There is a labor market here with an unmet need. And so invariably, immigrants from Mexico and Central America come to the Central Valley, settle here, and immediately begin working in farms. Or do packing, or do any of the related functions that are around that. And if you can't afford an attorney, you can't afford to get the right to work. Because in order to get the right to work, you need to go through a process where you apply for permission to work. And that's not something that's given automatically. What I'm trying to say is that the system, unfortunately, has created so many hurdles for our clients that if we don't think in a more progressive way in order to provide these services, clients will be continued to be turned away, and we are going to see deportation numbers go up and up, and we're never going to really see that go down because our system is stacked up against people who come from abroad for all of the reasons that you've heard from the speaker before me. But they're also stacked up against our clients because of lack of resources. And that's a really key piece to what's going on here. So let's say you make it through this process, you get out of custody through hook or crook, you've got family members who are able to pay that high bond, then what happens? Well, you get court dates, right? And when you think about, a court date, you don't think of something that takes more than 6 months or 8 months, right? How many of you have had any interaction with the legal system? Like a name change, maybe a divorce, anything like that, right? Right. So what if I told you that a deportation process in San Francisco, and by the way, San Francisco is the immigration court that has what we call jurisdiction, which is control over the Central Valley. What if I told you it takes 4 years to finish your case? It is not uncommon for judges in San Francisco here. Today I went to a hearing, today morning, right, for a client. And I got a hearing date that's in 2018. I got a September 15th, 2018. And that is not to finish the case. That's not to finish the case. That's just another appearance in order to ask for another date. So that case may not be resolved until, say, 2020, right? And some of you may be lawyers by then. And I hope that you are.
Does the client have work authorization in the meantime or not?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So if you're an applicant for asylum, you have to wait for 6 months. And if you're lucky enough to have an attorney who can navigate through the process of applying for asylum and go through the employment authorization process, you can get work permission, right? And so work permission is so critical even for people who can't work. So minors under the age of 16 still need work authorization because that's the pathway to getting a social security number. So all of these things are connected, and I want to urge you to think about doing deportation defense because I can't personally imagine a more fulfilling career for myself, but the impact that it has not only on your client and the family, but the community is so great. Because what you're doing is you're actually empowering entire families that reside within the community, and you're actually lifting up the economic situation for people in a very dramatic way. And I'm able to see this over the years with my clients who come back to us, and apart from all the thanks and everything, they tell me stories of how their kids are able to either go to college or seek opportunities that they never, ever in their wildest imaginations expected for themselves. So the other difficult situation about doing this work is that invariably when you have people who are victims of trauma, they have psychological needs as well, right? When you've suffered for a long time and you've dealt with horrific circumstances, you can't just uproot, come to a new country, feel the cultural change and somehow integrate. That's just not how it works. And so another big piece about doing this work is recognizing the need for what we in the nonprofit sector call wraparound services. So we handle the legal side of things, but a big part of what we do is taking care of our clients, not just in the legal sense, but being able to work with people who are therapists and psychologists, people who are professionals in the benefits world, and connecting our clients with those things in order to really make a difference. Because just fixing deportation is going to just deal with their legal side, but it's not going to really address the root problem, right? Because the root problem is that individuals who come to this country have other needs as well. And that often isn't talked about. It's not in the news. And you don't really hear about the reasons why people come to this country. We hear a lot of rhetoric about people who abuse process. But then there isn't a lot of stories about people who actually come here because they didn't have an option to. So I want you to imagine this for a moment. And this is sort of a story that's becoming more and more common. You're a 15-year-old, let's say you're a 15-year-old woman, and you live in El Salvador. You live in San Salvador. And you need to get to the United States. And the reason why you need to get to the United States is because for the last 3 years, gang members have been forcing you to have sexual relations. For the past 3 years in your community. You've not been able to go to school because you're basically scared to wake up and go outside. So you need to get to the United States. because that's what you think is the way out of this. But in order to get to the United States, there's no clear path, right? This isn't a trip to Paris for people here in this room, right? You can't just get a plane ticket and come to the U.S. How do you come to the U.S.? Well, you can take a bus, but the bus only gets you so far, and the highway is extraordinarily dangerous. So if you're lucky and you can collect up enough money, you can afford to contract with a coyote, and a coyote is basically a smuggler, someone who's going to help you through this process of getting into the U.S. I think I lost the mic here. Can everybody hear me in the back? Still good? Okay. So just this first process of being an individual in another country, facing this, you can already see the adversity that our clients have to deal with, right? I've not even gotten to the fact that you're in the U.S., dealing with a detention, dealing with a bond, trying to get out. None of that stuff. That's not even... So let's say you make it to the U.S. and because you're 15 years old, you're thrown into a special detention center for children. And you don't have any family members in the U.S. So where do you go? What do you think our system does for children that come to the U.S. and they're thrown into a detention center for kids? And luckily, those detention centers are separate. Yeah, they have to represent themselves in court, and there's no chance of getting out of that detention center. Our U.S. government has to coordinate with local schools because you still, regardless of who you are, you still have to go to school, but you're basically in a detention center, and you're having to fight for yourself. So this is, we live in a country where children are not provided attorneys. I think this is shocking perhaps to a lot of people, but there is absolutely no right to a free attorney no matter who you are in our immigration deportation system.
You think that'll change with the new Congress?
Well, with the new Congress, I'm not sure. I'm hoping that through litigation, and luckily the ACLU and some of the other mass impact litigation centers in the U.S. have taken on this mantle of litigating in this area. But I'm not confident that it's going to come from Congress. So this story that I just told you, it's not an uncommon story. Last year we represented over 1,000 families in the Bay Area and Central Valley, over 200 children, many of whom share the same story, and about half of them are here in the Central Valley area, anywhere between Fresno, Modesto, and more north of that. So, I would really, really urge you to think about a career in this. And, before I end, I just want to mention, internships. I have to make a plug for this because we're a nonprofit, and, we have a very well-developed internship program. So if you're interested in this work, please come and talk to me before you leave, and I'm happy to give you more details about it. So any questions? Any questions that you have about anything related to deportation, how the system works? I'm sorry I don't have a fancy PowerPoint. Yes?
The numbers are thrown around in regards to these immigrants. Are they talking about people who came to the country illegally and stayed, or who might be here and stayed? Are they talking partially about people who came to the country and in the situation they're talking about, they're hungry?
Yeah.
They can't support their family. They can't support themselves, so they work illegally. Now they're illegal.
Right.
So is that a large portion, or?
Well, it sort of depends on who's looking at the statistics and how they're interpreting it. Unfortunately, a lot of the statistics that you get about deportation come from ICE. And I, for one, when I look at those statistics, I know intuitively a lot of them are wrong. Because I'm in this world and I see that, and I know many of my colleagues in this world, they suspect how ICE creates those numbers. And there's not a lot of transparency with the numbers. It's hard. There aren't a lot of organizations tracking a lot of this. And a lot of the problem is because it's hard to keep tab on who's in a country and who's not, and who's here, quote unquote, with papers.
I have to wonder, having been through this process.
Yeah.
And then asked if they on a student visa and then got married, which is ironically the easiest way to get a green card. I have to wonder how many people become illegal, who come in under, how they're interviewing and they wait up to 4 years. How many then come actually become illegal during that time period because they're desperate?
Well, once they're in the process, they're already quote-unquote illegal. That's how it works. So yes, the answer is all of them. The answer is all of them when they're in this process. Right? So essentially when ICE issues what's known as the notice to appear, it's the equivalent of the complaint in a criminal case. That gets mailed to you, or if you're in a detention center, it gets handed to you. That means, quote-unquote, you're presumptively illegal. You're an alien, right? The terminology is also very inhumane. You get an A number, you're not mentioned, your name doesn't come into it here. You have an A number, and you're an alien, and you're a body. So when you talk to ICE officers, they say, we're going to move the body. Right? So that's how people in the system think about humans, other humans. And so, to answer your question, everyone in that process is considered illegal. So I don't know how those statistics are being applied or how they're being interpreted. Yes?
I'm undocumented, I'm green, and right now with all the political and all this stuff, I was kind of like stressed. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to get deported and all this stuff. I have DACA, I have
Right.
everything. And right now I'm going to go study abroad in the month of December. And I've been told that that could help me course, possibly getting, or fixing papers or whatever. Like, have you had other cases?
Yes, yeah. But you have to go through a process, a specific process. I can explain it to you afterward if you want. But yes, that's possible. But I want to talk about DACA because it's been coming up in the news a lot because of the new upcoming administration. DACA is one of these exclusive areas where it was completely created by President Obama and it can leave very easily under the hand of President Trump. What is very unfortunate about deferred action is it's not legal status. The president cannot create or revoke legal status. He or she can only create a permission to get work authorization. That's basically all that can happen. And so I'm getting, tons of emails from other organizations every day about this issue. What's going to happen to deferred action come January? The reality is nobody knows. Nobody knows. We suspect it's going to go away. It's on the chopping block. If any of the rhetoric that's gone on for the past 2 years is going to come to fruition, it's on the chopping block. The question of whether it's going to be retroactive or solely prospective, we don't know. But in the history of immigration law in this country, benefits have never been taken retroactively. They've always been taken from that day forward. So that's something to think about. But it's very scary to think that millions of young Americans who, for no fault of their own, are here in the U.S. are going to somehow have, the rug pulled under them. That's really what this is about. Most of whom have no criminal history whatsoever.
More questions?
Previously, right now, how people that register under DACA and stuff, they didn't know they were coming here illegally. But I find that somewhat problematic in the rhetoric where they're not criminalizing the child, but they're still criminalizing their parent, which I suppose still feeds into that fear, they need to criminalize someone. It's not going to be the kids who are going to do it to the parents, the grandparents, or whoever brought them here. So I feel like that rhetoric is so dangerous because, I've really met her, but, she's an amazing person, and I wouldn't want that kind of rhetoric to fall on her parents because that rhetoric is dangerous as well.
Oh, absolutely, and it's endemic to a system that perpetrates oppression, which is really what we have a broken immigration system, and when I say that, I mean it's broken to the core. It's the words that we use to ascribe to people, it's the process, it's the way we house people, it's the way we treat them in court, it's the way we delay cases, right? What are the stresses of having to wait 4 years to know whether or not you can stay here? and waking up every morning, you know, for those 1,300 days, not knowing whether you can be here, you know, and it's not just you, it's your family. Because 4 years is a big chunk of time in someone's life, you know. So, I mean, the challenge is to get more people to work on these issues. And when we started SJC in 2012, there was no one in the nonprofit sector doing this work as a mainstay. We were the first organization really who claimed to do this as our bread and butter. So my hope is, as there's more recognition of how important this is, we're going to see more organizations doing it, and we're going to have more young people like you all excited about getting into this field, but also not just getting excited about doing this work, but staying in communities where this work is needed. The Central Valley, to my understanding, has only 4 really reputable immigration attorneys, total. There are 4 in my building, you know. So that's how stark the cities versus rural communities differences is. And so it's so important to do this work, but to do it in geographically appropriate areas. That's the other big piece that I wanted to mention, you know.
Thank you.